The lawyer's voice on the other end of the line was apologetic but firm when he said, "Miss Hartwell, I'm calling about the property sale your sister completed last month. We need to discuss some irregularities with the paperwork." My hand went numb around the phone because I hadn't authorized any sale, and the beach house my grandmother left me was supposed to be mine forever. In that single moment, I realized the sister I protected my entire life had stolen the one thing that was truly mine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Before I tell you what happened after that call, let me ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you never thought to protect yourself from them? And when that trust shattered, did you blame yourself for not seeing the signs? Hold that thought, because this story is about more than just a stolen inheritance. It is about the moment you realize that the person you have been defending does not deserve your loyalty. My name is Claire Hartwell, and I spent 29 years believing that family loyalty meant absorbing every blow without complaint. I was the responsible one, the steady one, the sister who cleaned up messes and asked for nothing in return. My younger sister Vanessa was the golden child, blessed with charm and beauty that made people overlook her countless failings. Our parents worshipped her potential while taking my reliability for granted. I told myself it did not matter because I was strong enough to carry the weight for both of us. That delusion cost me more than I ever imagined possible. The story really begins 3 years before that phone call, on the day our grandmother passed away. Eleanor Hartwell was 92 years old when she died peacefully in her sleep at the beach house she had owned for 47 years. That house on the coast of Maine was more than just property. It was the repository of every happy childhood memory I possessed. Summer weeks spent collecting sea glass on the private beach, winter weekends watching storms roll in from the second-floor window seat, quiet mornings helping Grandma Eleanor tend her rose garden that somehow thrived despite the salt air. She had bought the house with money she inherited from her own mother, maintaining it through decades of changing coastal real estate markets. The house represented for generations of women who valued independence and strength. Grandma Eleanor and I shared a special bond that Vanessa never understood or perhaps never wanted. I would visit her every Sunday afternoon without fail, bringing groceries and handling small repairs around the property. We would sit on the wraparound porch drinking tea from her bone china cups, talking about everything and nothing. She told me stories about her young life, about leaving an unhappy marriage in an era when divorce was scandalous, about building a career as a school principal when few women held such positions. She taught me that a woman's worth was not determined by her ability to please others, but by her courage to live authentically. Those lessons shaped who I became, even though I failed to apply them when it mattered most. Vanessa rarely visited Grandma Eleanor. She would appear once or twice a year, always with some dramatic story about her latest failed relationship or career setback, always needing money or a place to stay temporarily. Grandma Eleanor would sigh quietly and write a check, never with the same warmth she showed me but never refusing either. After Vanessa left, Grandma would shake her head and say something like, "That girl mistakes charm for character. Life will teach her the difference eventually." I wish I had paid more attention to those warnings. When Grandma Eleanor's will was read, I was genuinely surprised to learn she had left the beach house solely to me. The will was explicit and carefully worded. The property at 47 Seacliff Drive, including the house, land, and all contents, was to pass to Claire Hartwell with the expressed intention that it remain in her possession as a family heritage property. Vanessa received a generous cash inheritance, approximately $150,000, along with Grandma's jewelry collection and several valuable paintings. The estate was divided fairly based on monetary value, but the house itself came to me alone. Vanessa's reaction was immediate and ugly. At the lawyer's office, her face flushed red as the will was explained. "This is ridiculous," she hissed once we were alone in the parking lot. "Grandma always liked you better. That house is worth at least $700,000. You got the valuable asset while I got pocket change." I tried to explain that the cash and jewelry actually equaled roughly half the estate's value, that Grandma had been scrupulously fair in the division. Vanessa was not interested in facts. She saw only that I had received the one asset with deep sentimental value, and in her mind, that constituted favoritism and injustice. The months following Grandma's death were difficult for many reasons. I was grieving the loss of the person who had understood me best, managing the complex emotions that accompany any significant death, and trying to navigate Vanessa's resentment. My parents did not help matters. Mom called regularly to suggest I should consider selling the house and splitting the proceeds with Vanessa to keep peace in the family. Dad mentioned repeatedly how hurt Vanessa felt, how she had always loved that house too, how sharing would be the generous thing to do. Neither of them acknowledged that Grandma had made her wishes clear or that Vanessa had already received a substantial inheritance. The message was unmistakable. My feelings and my inheritance rights mattered less than Vanessa's emotional comfort. I held firm on keeping the house, though I tried to compromise in other ways. I invited Vanessa to visit anytime she wanted, offered to host family gatherings there, and even suggested she could stay in the guest cottage during summer months if she needed a retreat. Every olive branch was rejected. Vanessa wanted ownership or money, not access. She wanted control, not connection. Our relationship, never particularly close, became actively hostile. She stopped responding to my calls and messages. At family events, she would arrive late, leave early, and spend the intervening time making pointed comments about people who hoarded family treasures selfishly. During this period, I was working as a senior accountant at a mid-sized firm in Portland, Maine. The job was demanding but rewarding, providing financial stability and intellectual challenge. I had worked hard to build my career, earning my CPA certification while working full-time, establishing a reputation for thoroughness and integrity. My life was not glamorous, but it was solid. I owned a modest townhouse, maintained a small circle of close friends, and spent weekends at the beach house working on restoration projects. The house needed significant updates after decades of Grandma's benign neglect. I was slowly renovating it, honoring her memory by preserving what made it special while modernizing what needed improvement. Vanessa's life during this same period was chaotic as usual. She had moved to Boston ostensibly to pursue opportunities in fashion marketing, but the reality involved a series of short-term jobs followed by dramatic exits. She dated wealthy men who initially found her captivating before discovering the maintenance required to sustain her lifestyle. She lived in expensive apartments she could barely afford, wore designer clothes purchased on credit, and maintained a social media presence that suggested a life of effortless luxury. The gap between her projected image and her actual circumstances was vast and growing. I watched this pattern with a mixture of concern and exasperation. Vanessa had burned through most of her inheritance within 18 months of receiving it. The money that should have provided a foundation for stability was instead consumed by luxury vacations, expensive dinners, designer wardrobes, and impulsive purchases. When she called me crying about being unable to pay her rent, I sent money. When she needed help with car payments after wrecking her leased BMW, I covered it. When she racked up credit card debt and collectors started calling, I paid off the balances. Each time she promised it was the last time, that she had learned her lesson, that things would be different going forward. Each time I believed her because the alternative was accepting that my sister was fundamentally irresponsible and potentially manipulative. My parents encouraged this enabling behavior, though they called it being supportive. "She's your sister," Mom would say whenever I expressed reluctance to bail Vanessa out again. "Family helps family. You're in a position to help, so you should." The implication was always that my financial stability was somehow accidental or unearned, that Vanessa's struggles were merely bad luck rather than consequences of choices. Nobody acknowledged that I lived modestly and saved carefully while Vanessa spent recklessly and planned never. Nobody suggested that perhaps Vanessa should face natural consequences, or that I deserved to keep the money I earned. The family narrative had been written long ago. I was the strong one who did not need support, and Vanessa was the fragile one who required constant rescue. Looking back now with clarity that only comes after devastating betrayal, I can see how perfectly I was positioned to be victimized. I had an asset of significant value that Vanessa coveted. I had a pattern of prioritizing family peace over my own interests. I had parents who would support Vanessa's narrative regardless of facts. I had a deep-seated need to be the good daughter, the reliable sister, the person who held everything together. Vanessa understood these vulnerabilities instinctively, the way predators understand the weaknesses of prey. She had been studying me my entire life, learning exactly which buttons to push and which levers to pull. The beach house became my refuge during this difficult period. Every weekend, I would drive the hour and 20 minutes from Portland to Seacliff, leaving behind the stress of work and family drama. I would spend Saturday mornings stripping old wallpaper or refinishing hardwood floors, tangible work that produced visible results. Saturday afternoons were for the garden, continuing Grandma Eleanor's tradition of coaxing roses to bloom in the challenging coastal environment. Sunday mornings I would sit on the porch with tea and watch the ocean, feeling connected to something larger than petty family conflicts. The house was not just property, it was my inheritance in the truest sense, a legacy of strength and independence passed from grandmother to granddaughter. I had the property appraised as part of estate planning and discovered it was worth approximately $720,000. The Maine coast had seen significant appreciation in property values, and the house sat on prime oceanfront land with private beach access. I could have sold it for a substantial profit, but the thought never seriously occurred to me. This was not an investment property or a financial asset. This was the place that held my best memories, represented my deepest connection to family history, and symbolized the woman I aspired to be. No amount of money could compensate for losing that. Vanessa knew how much the house meant to me. We had discussed it explicitly during one of her rare visits about a year after Grandma's death. She had arrived unannounced on a Saturday afternoon, which was unusual enough to put me on guard. We sat on the porch, and she asked what I planned to do with the property long-term. I explained that I intended to keep it permanently, eventually retire there, and perhaps pass it to my own children someday if I had them. She had looked at me strangely and asked whether I ever felt guilty about having so much when she had so little. I reminded her that she had received $150,000 plus valuable jewelry and art. She waved that away dismissively, saying the money was gone and the jewelry was just trinkets. The house was real wealth, she said, and it seemed unfair that one person should have so much. That conversation should have been a warning. Instead, I dismissed it as another example of Vanessa's inability to take responsibility for her own choices. I did not understand that she was not expressing general resentment but rather laying groundwork for a specific plan. She was testing my attachment to the property, confirming that I would never voluntarily sell or share it, and therefore determining that involuntary methods would be necessary. I was so focused on being understanding and compassionate that I failed to recognize reconnaissance when it was happening right in front of me. The 2 years following that conversation were relatively quiet in terms of family drama. Vanessa and I maintained minimal contact. She seemed to have stabilized somewhat, moving in with a boyfriend who had family money and therefore could subsidize her lifestyle. She posted less frequently on social media and stopped asking me for money. I allowed myself to hope that perhaps she had finally matured, that the crisis period had passed, that we might eventually rebuild a healthier relationship. I see now that the quiet period was simply the time she spent researching property law, studying forged signature techniques, and planning her betrayal in meticulous detail. I visited the beach house every weekend without exception, sometimes bringing friends or dates but often alone. I documented the renovation progress with photographs, maintained detailed records of improvements and expenses, and kept all the property documents in a fireproof safe at my townhouse. I was scrupulously organized about everything relating to the house because it mattered so much to me. The deed was in my name alone. The property taxes were paid from my account. The insurance policy listed me as the sole owner. Every legal and financial document confirmed that this property was mine and mine alone. I believed that made it secure. I had no idea that legal ownership is only as solid as the systems designed to protect it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My work life during this period was consuming in positive ways. I was promoted to senior manager, taking on more complex clients and mentoring junior accountants. The increased responsibility came with increased compensation, pushing my income into 6 figures for the first time. I was proud of what I had built through years of steady effort. I lived well below my means, saving aggressively for early retirement, taking modest vacations, and investing in the beach house renovations. My life was not exciting by Vanessa's standards, but it was mine, built on a foundation of integrity and hard work. I dated occasionally but nothing serious developed. My friend group was small but solid, consisting mostly of colleagues and a few women I had known since college. We would meet for dinner every few weeks, go hiking on occasional weekends, and support each other through life's normal challenges. These relationships were characterized by reciprocity and respect, so different from my family dynamics that I sometimes felt like I was living in two separate worlds. In one world, I was competent and valued. In the other, I was the supporting character in Vanessa's drama, expected to provide resources and assistance while accepting criticism and dismissal in return. My parents had retired to Florida, which created physical distance that initially felt like relief. Mom still called weekly to check in, though her calls almost always included some mention of Vanessa and subtle pressure to be more understanding or generous. Dad had largely checked out emotionally, content to let Mom manage family relationships while he played golf and avoided conflict. Neither of them had ever visited the beach house after it became mine, though I had invited them multiple times. Their absence spoke volumes about whose feelings they prioritized. The summer before the lawyer's call was particularly beautiful. I had completed the kitchen renovation, updating it while maintaining the vintage character that made it special. New appliances hid behind period-appropriate cabinet faces. The original farmhouse sink was restored and gleaming. Windows replaced decades ago with inferior versions were swapped for historically accurate reproductions that flooded the space with light. I hosted a small gathering to celebrate the completion, inviting my closest friends for a weekend. We cooked elaborate meals in the new kitchen, ate on the porch watching sunsets, and walked the beach collecting sea glass as I had done with Grandma Eleanor. It was perfect. It was mine. It was everything I had worked to preserve and improve. Vanessa was not invited to that gathering. We had not spoken in months following an argument about money. She had called asking for a loan to cover what she described as a temporary cash flow problem. When I asked for details, she became defensive and angry, accusing me of being judgmental and unsupportive. I had finally reached a limit and told her I would not be providing any more financial assistance, that she was 32 years old and needed to solve her own problems. She had hung up on me. I felt guilty about the boundary I had drawn, but I also felt relieved. The cycle of rescue and resentment had finally been broken, or so I thought. August turned to September, and I was busy with the start of the firm's busy season. Tax planning for high-net-worth clients required long hours and intense focus. I still made it to the beach house most weekends, but the visits were shorter and more focused on maintenance than relaxation. The garden needed preparation for winter. The exterior needed touch-up painting before cold weather arrived. I created a detailed list of projects to tackle before the harsh coastal winter set in. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September when my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was professionally courteous, belonging to a man who introduced himself as Thomas Whitmore, a real estate attorney based in Portland. He asked if I was Claire Hartwell, the owner of the property at 47 Seacliff Drive. I confirmed that I was, feeling a flutter of unease, though I could not have articulated why. He asked if I had a few moments to discuss an urgent matter regarding the property. I said yes, stepping away from my desk and moving to an empty conference room for privacy. What Thomas Whitmore told me in the next 3 minutes shattered my reality completely. He explained that his firm had handled a property sale closing the previous month for 47 Seacliff Drive. The property had sold for $695,000 to a family from Connecticut who planned to use it as a vacation home. The sale had proceeded normally with all apparently proper documentation, but a routine post-closing audit had revealed irregularities with the signature on the deed transfer. The buyer's title insurance company had hired a forensic document examiner, who determined that the signature did not match other signatures on file for Claire Hartwell. They had reason to believe the deed transfer was fraudulent and that I had not authorized the sale of my property. I remember the physical sensation of that moment with perfect clarity. The conference room seemed to tilt. My vision narrowed to a small point of focus while peripheral awareness faded to gray. My heart hammered so hard I could feel my pulse in my throat. I could not speak for several seconds, could not form words or thoughts, could only experience pure shock. When I finally found my voice, it came out as a whisper. I never sold the house. I would never sell that house. Thomas Whitmore's response was gentle but grave. I didn't think so, Miss Hartwell. That's why I'm calling. He explained that the woman who appeared at the closing had presented proper identification, or what appeared to be proper identification in my name. She had a driver's license, social security card, and copy of the original deed. She had answered questions about the property that demonstrated familiarity with it. She had been confident and professional, giving no indication that anything was amiss. The closing attorney who handled the transaction was a colleague of Thomas Whitmore's, a respected professional with decades of experience. Nothing about the closing had raised red flags at the time. Only the post-closing audit had revealed the fraud. I asked who had appeared at the closing. Thomas Whitmore hesitated, then said he needed to be careful about what he shared given that a criminal investigation would likely be forthcoming. But he understood I needed information, and he told me that the woman at the closing had identified herself as Claire Hartwell, approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall with blonde hair, driving a white BMW, and accompanied by a man she introduced as her husband. My hand started shaking. Vanessa was 5 feet 6 with blonde hair. Vanessa drove a white BMW, or at least she had when I last saw her. Vanessa had moved in with a boyfriend who could be described as a husband to people who did not ask too many questions. The lawyer continued explaining next steps. The sale would need to be unwound, a complex process involving lawyers, title insurance companies, and likely law enforcement. The buyers were innocent victims who had purchased property in good faith and would be made whole through title insurance. I would retain legal ownership of the house, but the process would take months and involve substantial legal fees. And of course I would need to file a police report because this was not just civil fraud but criminal identity theft and forgery. Someone would likely face serious charges, possibly prison time. I thanked Thomas Whitmore in a voice that did not sound like my own and ended the call. I sat in that conference room for I do not know how long, staring at the phone in my hand as my mind tried to process the impossible. My sister had stolen my identity. My sister had forged legal documents. My sister had sold the property that represented my deepest connection to family and history. My sister had pocketed nearly $700,000 that belonged to me. And she had done it all while we were not speaking, while I believed the worst of our relationship troubles was behind us, while I had finally started to build boundaries and protect myself. The betrayal was so complete and so calculated that I could not immediately absorb it. This was not a moment of weakness or a desperate impulse. This was planned and executed with precision. Vanessa had researched what documents would be needed. She had created or obtained false identification. She had studied property law enough to know how to navigate the process. She had found a boyfriend or accomplice willing to participate in serious fraud. She had forged my signature well enough to pass initial scrutiny. She had walked into a lawyer's office and lied with sufficient confidence to fool professionals. She had taken the money and disappeared, likely believing she had gotten away with it cleanly. I thought about all the times I had defended her, all the money I had sent when she claimed to be struggling, all the boundaries I had failed to set because I wanted to be a good sister, all the warnings I had ignored from people who saw her more clearly than I did. Grandma Eleanor's quiet comments about Vanessa mistaking charm for character. Friends who suggested I was being taken advantage of. My own instincts telling me something was wrong. Instincts I had suppressed because loyalty seemed more important than self-protection. I had been so determined to believe the best about my sister that I had made myself the perfect victim. The question that kept circling my mind was why. Not why had she done it, because I understood that Vanessa wanted money and felt entitled to the house. She had convinced herself that I had received something undeserved while she had gotten nothing. In her mind, stealing from me was not theft but rather redistribution of assets that should have been shared to begin with. I understood that twisted logic. What I could not understand was how she had justified the method. How did you look at your sister and decide to commit identity fraud? How did you forge signatures and lie to lawyers and steal someone's most precious possession? How did you sleep at night knowing you had not just taken money, but had violated every bond of trust and family connection? I pulled myself together enough to return to my desk and mechanically pack up my belongings. I told my supervisor I had a family emergency and needed to leave immediately. She looked at my face and asked if I was okay, if there was anything she could do. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. I drove home in a fog, navigating by instinct more than conscious thought. I wanted to call someone, talk to someone, share the burden with someone. But who? My parents would find a way to blame me or excuse Vanessa. My friends would be sympathetic, but could not truly understand the depth of betrayal involved in having your sister steal your identity and sell your inheritance. I was alone with this knowledge, alone with this pain. At home, I pulled out every document related to the beach house. The original deed showing my name as sole owner, the property tax records, the insurance policies, the appraisal documents, the renovation receipts. Every piece of paper confirmed what I knew to be true. That house was mine, left to me specifically by my grandmother who had trusted me to preserve it. And now it was gone, sold by someone pretending to be me, and I had not even known until the fraud was discovered by chance. If not for that routine audit, if not for the title insurance company being unusually thorough, I might never have known. Vanessa might have gotten away with it completely. I tried to call Vanessa. The number I had for her was no longer in service. I searched for her on social media and found her accounts had been deleted or made private. I called the boyfriend's number from memory and got a disconnected message. They had vanished. They had taken the money and disappeared, leaving me with wreckage to clean up and questions that would never be answered. The rage hit me then, sudden and consuming. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break things. I wanted to find Vanessa and make her understand the magnitude of what she had done. But I did none of those things. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by documents and felt something inside me shift and harden. My entire life I had been the accommodating one. I had swallowed resentments, ignored injustices, and prioritized family peace over personal needs. I had given and given until there was nothing left to give. I had loved my sister despite every reason not to. I had believed that loyalty and forgiveness were virtues to be practiced regardless of whether they were reciprocated. That version of me died in that moment. What rose from the ashes was someone who understood that some betrayals cannot be forgiven, and some people do not deserve your loyalty. Vanessa had finally taught me a lesson I should have learned decades earlier. Family is not an excuse for abuse, and blood does not entitle someone to destroy you. I would get my house back. I would press charges. I would cooperate fully with law enforcement. I would ensure Vanessa faced every possible consequence for what she had done. And I would never speak to her again, not to forgive, not to reconcile, not for any reason. She had sold my inheritance, but in doing so, she had freed me from an obligation I should never have accepted. I did not owe her anything anymore. I did not owe my parents my silence or my protection of Vanessa's reputation. I did not owe anyone the performance of family unity when the reality was betrayal and theft. The lawyer had said the process would take months. I would use that time to rebuild myself into someone who could not be victimized again. Someone with boundaries as solid as bedrock. Someone who valued themselves enough to walk away from toxic people regardless of whether they shared DNA. Someone who understood that the greatest betrayals come from those you trust most, and therefore trust must be earned and can be permanently revoked. That night I did not sleep. I lay in bed watching headlights cross my ceiling as cars passed outside, thinking about every moment that had led to this one. Every time I had sent money instead of enforcing consequences. Every time I had defended Vanessa to people who saw through her. Every time I had suppressed my own needs to accommodate hers. The pattern was so clear in retrospect. I had trained my family to treat me as someone whose feelings and rights were less important than maintaining comfortable illusions. I had been complicit in my own exploitation. But that ended now. The person I had been was gone. Destroyed by a betrayal so profound that it changed something fundamental. What emerged was harder, wiser, and far less willing to sacrifice herself on the altar of family obligation. Vanessa had wanted my inheritance. Instead, she had given me the gift of clarity. I finally saw my family exactly as they were, and that clear vision was the beginning of freedom. The morning after the lawyer's call, I woke at dawn with the kind of clarity that only comes after a sleepless night spent confronting devastating truths. My eyes were dry and gritty, my body exhausted, but my mind was sharp in a way it had not been in years. I had spent the dark hours thinking not just about what Vanessa had done, but about how our entire history had built toward this moment of ultimate betrayal. To understand how my sister could steal my inheritance, I needed to trace the thread backward through decades of family dysfunction that had normalized her entitlement and my self-sacrifice. Vanessa and I were born 3 years apart in a small town in central Maine where our father managed a hardware store and our mother worked part-time at the local library. We were not wealthy, but we were comfortable enough that money was not a constant source of stress. Our childhood home was a modest ranch on a quiet street where kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on and neighbors knew each other's names. From the outside, we probably looked like a normal family with normal sibling dynamics. The reality was far more complicated and far more damaging than anyone beyond our front door understood. From my earliest memories, I was the responsible child. I do not recall a specific moment when that role was assigned to me, but by the time I was 6 or 7, it was already firmly established. I was the one who could be trusted to come straight home from school, to do homework without reminders, to set the table without being asked, to watch Vanessa while mom ran errands. Adults praised my maturity and reliability with that particular tone that sounds like compliment but functions as obligation. "Claire is such a good girl," they would say, which meant Claire could be counted on to put others' needs before her own indefinitely. Vanessa, by contrast, was adored for qualities that required nothing of her. She was beautiful even as a small child, with blonde curls and enormous blue eyes that made strangers stop to comment. She was charming and funny, quick with words in a way that made adults laugh indulgently at behavior they would have corrected in other children. When Vanessa talked back to teachers, it was because she was spirited. When she forgot to do chores, it was because she was creative and above mundane tasks. When she demanded the largest piece of cake or the best seat in the car, it was just her vibrant personality asserting itself. Every flaw was reframed as a feature, while I was simply expected to be good without praise or recognition because that was my nature. Our parents loved us both, I do not doubt that. But they loved us differently in ways that would shape the rest of our lives. They loved Vanessa the way you love a beautiful fragile thing that must be protected and displayed. They loved me the way you love a sturdy, reliable tool that requires no maintenance and justifies no particular gratitude. I learned early that my value lay in my usefulness, in my ability to make their lives easier by requiring nothing while providing support for Vanessa's more demanding presence. The pattern was set before I was old enough to recognize it, let alone resist it. School reinforced these roles. I was a solid student who earned good grades through consistent effort. Teachers appreciated my work ethic but rarely singled me out for special recognition because I was not the type of student who stood out. I participated appropriately, completed assignments on time, and never caused disruptions. I was exactly the kind of student teachers appreciate but forget the moment the school year ends. Vanessa, meanwhile, was memorable. She starred in school plays, won awards for creative writing, and became the center of attention in every classroom she entered. She struggled with subjects that required sustained effort like mathematics and science, but she excelled at anything involving performance or persuasion. Teachers either loved her and made excuses for her incomplete work, or found her exhausting and passed her along to avoid conflict. At home, my role as Vanessa's support system intensified as we grew older. By middle school, I was helping her with homework she did not want to complete, lending her clothes and money she never returned, and covering for her when she broke rules or missed curfew. Our parents not only allowed this dynamic but actively encouraged it. When I complained about Vanessa borrowing my things without asking, Mom would sigh and say something like, "She looks up to you, Claire. Sharing is what sisters do." When I protested having to help with her homework when I had my own work to complete, Dad would remind me that I found schoolwork easier and should help those who struggled. The message was always the same. My needs and boundaries were less important than keeping Vanessa happy and successful. The financial dimension of our relationship began in high school. Vanessa wanted designer clothes and expensive accessories that our parents' modest income could not easily provide. She would cry and beg and create scenes until they gave in, often sacrificing things they needed to fund her wants. I watched this pattern with growing resentment but said nothing because keeping peace seemed more important than asserting fairness. I got a job at 15 working after school and weekends at a local cafe. I saved most of what I earned, planning vaguely for college and independence. Vanessa did not work because her social life and extracurricular activities were too demanding, according to our parents, though I somehow managed to balance work with equally demanding academic commitments. By the time I was a senior in high school, I had saved nearly $4,000. I was proud of that money, proud of the discipline and sacrifice it represented. I had plans to use it for college expenses, to reduce the loans I would need to take, to start my adult life on solid financial footing. Then Vanessa needed money for a school trip to Europe, an optional program that cost $3,500. Our parents could not afford it. They asked if I would consider lending Vanessa the money, just a loan, to be paid back from her summer job earnings. I remember the sick feeling in my stomach as I agreed, knowing even then that I would never see that money again. Vanessa went to Europe and had the time of her life based on the photos she shared constantly. She never got the summer job. The loan was never mentioned again. That pattern would repeat itself with variations throughout our young adult years. I would work and save, Vanessa would need money for something she presented as essential, our parents would facilitate the transfer by framing it as family obligation, and I would watch my savings disappear into her lifestyle while receiving nothing beyond a casual thanks if that. I told myself it was temporary, that once we were both independent adults the dynamic would change, that Vanessa would mature and become responsible. I was wrong on every count, but I would not fully understand that for many more years. College was my escape and my education in more ways than academic. I attended the University of Maine on a combination of scholarships and loans, majoring in accounting because I was good with numbers and the career prospects were solid. I lived frugally in a shared apartment off campus, worked part-time jobs throughout my enrollment, and graduated in 4 years with minimal debt and a job offer already in hand. It was not glamorous, but it was mine, built through my own effort without depending on anyone. For the first time in my life, I felt autonomous and capable in ways that had nothing to do with my usefulness to others. Vanessa's college experience was characteristically different. She attended a private liberal arts college that our parents could not afford, requiring them to take out substantial loans and second mortgages on their house. She changed majors 3 times, took 6 years to graduate, and emerged with a degree in art history and no particular career plan. Throughout those years, she called regularly with financial emergencies. Her meal plan ran out and she needed grocery money. Her car broke down and she needed repair costs. She wanted to spend spring break in Miami with friends and needed travel money. Each time, she called me because our parents had extended themselves to their limit. Each time I sent money because the alternative was listening to her manipulate and guilt trip until I gave in anyway. During those college years, I maintained my close relationship with Grandma Eleanor through weekly phone calls and monthly visits when I could afford the gas money to drive to Seacliff. She was my refuge from family drama, the one person who saw and valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. We would sit on her porch and talk about everything. She told me about her life, about the choices she had made and the mistakes she had learned from. She asked about my studies, my job prospects, my hopes for the future. She never asked me to fix her problems or take care of her needs beyond the basic assistance I gladly provided. Our relationship was reciprocal in a way my family relationships were not. Grandma Eleanor saw the family dynamics clearly even when I was still too enmeshed to recognize them fully. She commented occasionally on Vanessa's visits, which were rare and always motivated by needing something. "Your sister has learned to take but not to give," she observed once after Vanessa had stopped by asking for money to cover credit card bills. "That's a dangerous way to go through life. People who only take eventually find themselves alone because they've used everyone up." I defended Vanessa reflexively, making excuses about her being young and still figuring things out. Grandma Eleanor just looked at me with those sharp eyes and said, "You're young too, Claire. But you figured out how to be responsible. Age isn't the issue. Character is." After college, I began my career at a mid-sized accounting firm in Portland. The work was challenging and sometimes tedious, but I was good at it and found satisfaction in solving complex financial puzzles. I advanced steadily through the ranks from junior accountant to senior accountant to manager, earning promotions based on merit and consistent performance. I bought my townhouse at 26, a modest 2-bedroom unit in a decent neighborhood that I could afford comfortably on my salary. I was building a life that felt solid and sustainable, though perhaps not exciting by conventional standards. Vanessa's post-college years were a series of false starts and dramatic failures. She moved to Boston with vague plans to break into fashion marketing, a field she had no qualifications for and no realistic strategy to enter. She worked briefly at a high-end boutique, got fired for unreliability, then worked at a marketing agency until she had a fight with her supervisor and quit dramatically. Between jobs, she lived on credit cards and money from our parents, who somehow always found resources to send despite claiming they were stretched thin. When their ability to help ran out, she turned to me. The requests started small and grew progressively larger. $100 for rent when she was short, $300 for a security deposit on a new apartment, $500 when her roommate moved out unexpectedly, $1,000 to pay off a credit card before it went to collections. Each request came with a detailed explanation of circumstances beyond her control and a sincere promise to pay me back. I kept a mental ledger of what she owed, but I never asked for repayment because I knew it would create conflict, and I had been trained since childhood to avoid conflict with Vanessa at any cost. Looking back now with the perspective of someone who has been catastrophically betrayed, I can see exactly how those years of small compliances prepared me to accept larger violations. Every time I sent money I could not afford to send, I told myself it was just this once, just helping family through a rough patch. Every time I swallowed my resentment when Vanessa never thanked me or acknowledged the sacrifice, I told myself that keeping peace was more important than being appreciated. Every time I made myself smaller and quieter to accommodate her larger and louder presence, I reinforced the dynamic that would eventually lead to her believing she was entitled to everything I had, including property that legally and morally belonged to me alone. The inheritance from Grandma Eleanor should have been a clean break, a clear moment when Vanessa and I each received our portion and went our separate ways. The will was unambiguous. I received the house because Grandma Eleanor wanted me specifically to have it. Vanessa received cash and valuables that were roughly equivalent in monetary terms. It was fair by any objective measure. But fairness requires accepting that other people have rights and boundaries, and Vanessa had never learned that lesson because our family had never taught it to her. Vanessa's reaction to the will was immediate and volcanic. She accused me of manipulating Grandma Eleanor, of poisoning her mind against Vanessa, of being sneaky and underhanded to secure the valuable asset for myself. None of this was true, but truth was irrelevant to Vanessa's narrative. She needed to believe she was the victim because accepting that Grandma Eleanor had made a deliberate choice based on our respective characters would require self-reflection she was incapable of. It was easier to blame me than to ask why the grandmother who knew us both well had trusted me with the property that meant so much to our family. Our parents' response to the will was more subtle but equally damaging. They never directly accused me of wrongdoing, but they made it clear they thought I should accommodate Vanessa's feelings by selling the house and splitting the proceeds. Mom called repeatedly in the weeks after the will was read, suggesting gently that family harmony was more important than property, that Grandma Eleanor would have wanted us to be close, that maybe keeping the house was selfish when it caused so much pain. Dad said less, but his silence was eloquent. He did not defend my inheritance rights or acknowledge that Grandma Eleanor's wishes should be respected. His neutrality was actually taking Vanessa's side because it suggested the situation was ambiguous when it was not. I tried to compromise by offering Vanessa unlimited access to the house, inviting her to visit whenever she wanted, suggesting we host family gatherings there. Every offer was rejected with barely concealed contempt. She did not want access. She wanted ownership or money. She wanted control or compensation. The house itself meant nothing to her beyond its monetary value and what it represented about our grandmother's preference. If she could not have it or profit from it, then she wanted me to suffer for having it. That spite should have warned me about what was coming, but I still could not imagine she would go as far as she eventually did. During the 2 years between inheriting the house and Vanessa stealing it, I poured my energy into restoration and preservation. Every weekend I drove to Seacliff and worked on projects large and small. I stripped wallpaper that had been there for 40 years and repainted in colors that honored the house's vintage character. I refinished hardwood floors that had been covered by carpet for decades. I updated bathrooms and the kitchen with fixtures that were modern and functional but architecturally appropriate. I worked in Grandma Eleanor's garden, learning through trial and error how to maintain roses in the harsh coastal environment. Every hour I spent there was an investment of love, not just money. I documented everything meticulously because that was my nature and my training. I kept spreadsheets tracking every expense, every improvement, every hour of labor. I took photographs showing the progress from room to room, season to season. I saved every receipt and every invoice. I maintained detailed records of property taxes paid, insurance premiums, utility bills. I did this partly out of professional habit and partly because I wanted to honor what Grandma Eleanor had entrusted to me by being a responsible steward. The house was not just my property. It was a legacy I was maintaining for future generations, a tangible connection to family history that stretched back through 4 generations of strong women. The irony of my meticulous record-keeping is that it would eventually help prove the fraud but could not prevent it. I had every document proving my ownership, but those documents were useless when someone stole my identity and forged my signature. Legal ownership only matters when the systems designed to verify ownership function correctly. Vanessa understood this weakness in the system and exploited it brilliantly. She knew that with the right fake identification and sufficient confidence, she could walk into a real estate closing and sell property she did not own. She knew that most people trust that others are telling the truth about their identity, because to do otherwise would make normal transactions impossible. She knew that her appearance, her charm, her ability to lie convincingly would carry her through the process if she prepared adequately. The question that haunted me during those sleepless hours after the lawyer's call was when she had decided to do this. Had it been immediately after learning the terms of the will, a long simmering plan that took 2 years to research and execute? Or had it been more recent, a desperate measure when her money ran out and she needed a large influx of cash? I would probably never know the answer, but I suspected the truth was somewhere in between. She had probably considered it as a possibility early on, then spent months or years working out the details, waiting for the right moment when I would be least suspicious and most vulnerable. The cruelty of the timing was striking. She had executed the fraud during a period when we were not speaking, when I had finally set a boundary about giving her money. That boundary had likely triggered her decision to move forward, because it signaled that she could no longer manipulate me through normal channels. If I would not give her money voluntarily, she would take it by force through fraud and deception. The boundary I had been so proud of setting had actually precipitated the worst betrayal because it forced her to escalate to more extreme measures rather than accept limits on her exploitation. I thought about all the moments I could have prevented this if I had been willing to see my sister clearly. The time she asked detailed questions about the house's value and the deed paperwork. The time she showed up unannounced and spent an afternoon photographing every room, claiming she wanted memories of Grandma Eleanor's house. The time she asked if I kept the deed in a safe deposit box or at home, casual curiosity that was actually reconnaissance. Every interaction took on sinister new meaning when viewed through the lens of her eventual betrayal. She had been planning this, studying me and the property, gathering information she would need to impersonate me and complete the fraud. The worst part was not the financial loss, though $700,000 was devastating to lose. The worst part was understanding that my sister had looked at me, the person who had supported her for decades, and decided I was simply an obstacle to be eliminated through whatever means necessary. She had stolen not just property but my identity, my sense of safety, my ability to trust. She had violated every bond that was supposed to make family sacred. And she had done it without apparent hesitation or remorse, then disappeared with the money believing she had gotten away with it cleanly. As dawn broke and pale light filtered through my bedroom windows, I made concrete decisions about how to move forward. I would call the police and file a report that morning. I would cooperate fully with whatever investigation followed. I would hire the best lawyer I could afford to pursue both criminal prosecution and civil recovery. I would document every interaction, save every email, record every phone call where legally permitted. I would be as meticulous about seeking justice as I had been about maintaining the house Vanessa stole. She would face consequences for what she had done, not because I was vindictive but because some violations are too severe to go unanswered. I would also finally tell my parents the truth about their golden child. The complete unvarnished truth about decades of exploitation culminating in identity fraud and theft. They would try to minimize it or explain it away or blame me somehow for not preventing it. I was prepared for that. I was prepared to walk away from them too if they could not acknowledge reality. I had spent my entire life sacrificing my needs to maintain family relationships that were fundamentally unhealthy. That ended now. If the cost of having my own boundaries and protecting my own interests was losing relationships with people who only valued me as a resource to be exploited, then that was a cost I was willing to pay. The person I had been would have absorbed this betrayal quietly, found some way to blame herself, made excuses for Vanessa based on her struggles or mental health or whatever rationalization made it possible to maintain the fiction of family unity. That person was gone, destroyed by a violation so complete that it permitted no ambiguity. What remained was someone harder and clearer, Someone who understood that love without respect is worthless and family without trust is just biology. Vanessa had taught me the most valuable and most painful lesson of my life. Some people will take everything you have and then blame you for not giving more. The only protection is recognizing that truth and acting accordingly. I rose from bed, showered, dressed in professional clothes that felt like armor, and prepared to spend the day dismantling what remained of my relationship with my sister, and potentially my entire family of origin. It would be painful. It would be lonely. But it would be honest in a way my family relationships had never been. And honesty, I was learning, was worth more than the comfortable lies I had been living with for 29 years. The police station smelled like industrial cleaning solution and burnt coffee, a combination that would forever be associated in my mind with the moment I formally reported my sister for felony fraud. I sat in a small interview room with cream-colored walls and fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly jaundiced, speaking to Detective Sarah Martinez, a woman in her early 40s with tired eyes that suggested she had seen every variety of human betrayal. I told her the entire story from beginning to end, watching her expression shift from professional neutrality to something resembling sympathy as the details accumulated. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and said something I would never forget. Family fraud cases are always the worst. Strangers steal your money. Family steals your ability to trust anyone. The process of filing the report took nearly 3 hours. Detective Martinez needed every detail about the property, the inheritance, my relationship with Vanessa, and the timeline of events leading to the fraudulent sale. She asked questions that felt invasive but were necessary to build a case. When had I last seen Vanessa in person? Did I have any documentation of previous financial transactions between us? Had there been any recent arguments or conflicts that might have motivated the fraud? Could I provide photographs of Vanessa and any identifying information like social security number or last known address? Each question reminded me that my sister was now a criminal suspect, and I was the victim of a crime serious enough to warrant felony charges. Detective Martinez explained what would happen next. The case would be assigned to the Financial Crimes Division, which would work with the district attorney's office to determine what charges to pursue. They would need to obtain the closing documents from the real estate transaction to compare signatures and gather evidence. They would attempt to locate Vanessa and any accomplices who had participated in the fraud. They would investigate where the money from the sale had gone, though she warned me that recovering funds from fraud cases was notoriously difficult. If Vanessa had already spent or hidden the money, I might never see any of it regardless of whether she was prosecuted successfully. The legal process would take months at minimum, possibly years if Vanessa contested the charges or fled the jurisdiction. I left the police station feeling simultaneously relieved to have taken action and overwhelmed by the magnitude of what lay ahead. Reporting the crime made it real in a way it had not been before. My sister was now wanted by law enforcement. There would be investigations and possibly arrests and trials. The family drama that had always been private would become public record. Everyone would know what Vanessa had done and by extension what kind of family we were. The shame of that publicity sat heavy in my chest even though I knew intellectually that I had nothing to be ashamed of. Victims should not carry shame for crimes committed against them, but knowing that did not prevent the feeling. My next call was to my parents, a conversation I had been dreading since the lawyer first contacted me. I drove to a park near the police station and sat in my car gathering courage before dialing their Florida number. Mom answered on the third ring, her voice bright with the artificial cheer she always deployed when speaking to me, so different from the warm, genuine tone she used with Vanessa. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told her directly that Vanessa had stolen my identity and fraudulently sold the beach house, that I had just filed a police report, and that she would likely be facing serious criminal charges. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Mom's voice came back, small and confused. That can't be right. Vanessa wouldn't do something like that. There must be some mistake. I explained the situation again with more detail, describing the lawyer's call and the evidence of forged signatures and fake identification. Mom's confusion shifted to something defensive and angry. She asked why I was so quick to assume Vanessa was responsible. Maybe someone else had stolen both our identities. Maybe this was a misunderstanding that could be cleared up without involving police. Maybe I was overreacting because of old resentments about the inheritance. Each suggestion was more absurd than the last, transparent attempts to avoid accepting that her favorite daughter was a criminal who had committed a serious felony against her own sister. I listened to the rationalizations with something close to clinical detachment, noting how predictable her response was and how little it hurt because I had expected nothing different. Dad got on the line and took a different approach. He did not deny that Vanessa might be responsible, but he suggested that maybe there were extenuating circumstances I did not understand. Maybe she was desperate and not thinking clearly. Maybe she had gotten involved with bad people who pressured her into it. Maybe she had a substance abuse problem or mental health crisis that explained her actions. Every maybe was designed to minimize her agency and accountability, to transform her from perpetrator to victim of forces beyond her control. I listened to him spin these narratives and felt the last threads of connection to my parents begin to fray. They would never hold Vanessa accountable for anything. They would always find ways to excuse or explain away her behavior no matter how egregious. That meant they would always sacrifice me to protect her because that was the only role I had ever been permitted to play in our family system. The conversation ended badly. Mom was crying, saying I was tearing the family apart by involving police instead of handling this privately. Dad was angry, accusing me of being vindictive and unforgiving, suggesting that I wanted to see my sister in prison out of jealousy or spite. Neither of them asked how I was feeling or whether I needed support. Neither acknowledged that I was the victim of a serious crime. Their only concern was protecting Vanessa from consequences and preserving their illusion of a functional family. I told them I would not be discussing this further until they were ready to acknowledge reality, then ended the call. My hands were shaking but my voice had remained steady throughout. That steadiness felt like a victory. Proof that I was becoming someone who could not be manipulated or gaslit into doubting my own perception of events. The following days blurred together in a haze of phone calls with lawyers, insurance companies, and law enforcement. Thomas Whitmore, the real estate attorney who at first alerted me to the fraud, connected me with a colleague who specialized in property fraud cases. Her name was Jennifer Okafor, and she was exactly the kind of attorney I needed at that moment. She was direct without being unkind, experienced without being jaded, and absolutely clear about what I could expect from the legal process. She explained that unwinding the fraudulent sale would require cooperation from multiple parties including the innocent buyers, their title insurance company, and the company that had insured the fraudulent closing. Everyone involved would want to resolve the situation quickly to limit their liability exposure, which meant I would likely regain clear title to the property within a few months. However, Jennifer warned that the financial recovery would be far more complicated. The buyers had paid $695,000 for the property, money that had gone to Vanessa or whoever she was working with. The title insurance would make the buyers whole by refunding their purchase price, but that did not help me. I had not lost money in the conventional sense because I still technically owned the property that Vanessa had sold. What I had lost was 2 years of fraudulent liability, since the buyers had believed they owned the house and had been paying property taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs that I was technically responsible for as the actual owner. I would need to reimburse them for those expenses, which Jennifer estimated could be $15,000 to $20,000. Additionally, I would have legal fees and costs associated with clearing the title and resolving the fraud, which could easily reach another $20,000 to $30,000. The cruel mathematics of the situation became clear. Even though I would keep the house, the fraud would cost me potentially $50,000 in various expenses and fees. Vanessa had attempted to steal $700,000, and even though her theft would ultimately be reversed, I would still suffer significant financial harm from her actions. Jennifer explained that I could pursue civil action against Vanessa to recover these costs, but winning a judgment and actually collecting on it were two different things. If Vanessa had spent or hidden the money from the sale, there might be nothing to collect even with a court judgment in my favor. The legal system could punish her criminally, but might never make me financially whole. I hired Jennifer to represent me in all the property-related matters, and began the process of documenting every expense I could anticipate or had already incurred because of the fraud. This was work I knew how to do, creating spreadsheets and organizing receipts, turning chaos into ordered data that could be analyzed and acted upon. The familiar work was soothing in a strange way. giving me something concrete to control when so much felt overwhelmingly beyond my influence. I calculated that between legal fees, reimbursements to the buyers, and lost time from work to deal with the crisis, Vanessa's attempted theft would ultimately cost me somewhere between $55,000 and $65,000, even in the best-case scenario where I regained the property quickly and without major complications. Detective Martinez called midway through the first week to inform me that they had located Vanessa's last known address in Boston and had attempted to make contact. She was no longer living at that address, and the landlord reported that she had broken her lease 2 months earlier and moved out in the middle of the night, owing several months of back rent. The landlord had been trying to locate her to pursue payment but had been unsuccessful. This was not surprising given the timeline of the fraudulent sale. Vanessa had closed on the property 6 weeks before I learned about it, which meant she had received the money and immediately disappeared. She had planned not just the fraud itself but also her escape, understanding that once the crime was discovered she would need to be somewhere law enforcement could not easily find her. The detective asked whether I had any idea where Vanessa might have gone. I thought about the question carefully, trying to remember every conversation we had ever had about places she wanted to live or visit. She had always talked about moving somewhere warm and glamorous, Los Angeles or Miami, somewhere she could reinvent herself and live the life she believed she deserved. But those were fantasies, and Vanessa was now a fugitive with $700,000 in stolen money, and presumably enough intelligence to avoid obvious locations. She could be anywhere, living under a fake name, perhaps even out of the country if she had been sophisticated enough to obtain false identification that would pass airport security. The woman who had researched property law and forged signatures well enough to fool professionals was certainly capable of planning a more comprehensive escape. I told Detective Martinez everything I could remember that might be useful, but the truth was I did not know my sister well enough to predict her behavior under these circumstances. The Vanessa I thought I knew would never have committed identity fraud in the first place. The Vanessa who actually existed was a stranger capable of anything. That realization was disorienting in a fundamental way. I had spent 29 years in a relationship with someone I had completely misunderstood. Every memory now felt suspect, every moment of apparent connection possibly just manipulation. Had she ever genuinely cared about me, or had I always been nothing more than a resource to be exploited? I would probably never know the answer, and that uncertainty was its own kind of grief. My work suffered during this period as my focus fractured between my job responsibilities and the consuming demands of dealing with the fraud. I was a senior manager responsible for multiple client accounts and a team of junior accountants who looked to me for guidance and leadership. Normally I could handle the workload comfortably, but now I found myself making uncharacteristic errors, missing details in financial statements, arriving late to meetings because I had been on calls with lawyers or law enforcement. My supervisor, a woman named Patricia Chun who had been with the firm for 20 years, called me into her office at the end of the second week to ask if everything was all right. I had always been intensely private about my personal life at work, maintaining clear boundaries between professional and personal spheres. But the fraud had become too large to contain within those boundaries. I told Patricia a condensed version of what had happened, explaining that I was dealing with a family member who had committed fraud against me, and that the legal process was requiring significant time and energy. I did not provide unnecessary details or seek sympathy, merely stated the facts to explain why my performance had been affected. Patricia listened without interrupting, then said something that surprised me. She shared that her own brother had stolen from their mother years earlier, draining her bank accounts to fund a gambling addiction. The family had never recovered from the betrayal, and Patricia had not spoken to her brother in over a decade. She understood the unique pain of being victimized by someone who was supposed to love and protect you. She told me to take whatever time I needed to deal with the legal matters, that the firm would support me through this crisis, and that my job was secure regardless of how long the process took. That unexpected compassion from someone I had always related to purely professionally broke something loose inside me. I cried in Patricia's office, not dramatic sobs but quiet tears that I could not quite control. She handed me tissues and sat in supportive silence until I collected myself. When I apologized for the unprofessional display of emotion, she waved it away. You're dealing with a profound betrayal by someone who should have been trustworthy. If you weren't emotional about it, I'd be concerned about your humanity. That validation from someone whose opinion I respected helped more than she probably realized. The world was not entirely made up of people like Vanessa and my parents. There were also people like Patricia and Jennifer Okafor and Detective Martinez, people who saw injustice and responded with appropriate concern and support. The third week brought a development that simultaneously relieved and enraged me. The title insurance company had hired forensic investigators who had successfully traced the money from the fraudulent sale. $695,000 had been deposited into a bank account opened 2 months before the closing using fake identification in my name. Within 48 hours of the deposit, the money had been withdrawn in a series of transactions designed to obscure the trail. $300,000 had been wire transferred to an overseas account in the Cayman Islands. $200,000 had been converted to cashier's checks and cashed at various banks. The remaining $195,000 had been withdrawn in cash over 3 days from different branch locations. The sophistication of these transactions suggested Vanessa had help from someone with financial expertise, possibly the boyfriend she had been living with or a new associate she had recruited specifically for this crime. Detective Martinez explained that the overseas transfer would be nearly impossible to recover without cooperation from Cayman Island banking authorities, which was unlikely to be forthcoming. The cashier's checks had been cashed and those funds were gone. The cash withdrawals had left no trail. Essentially, Vanessa had successfully laundered the stolen money in a way that made recovery almost impossible, even if she was eventually apprehended. She might face years in prison if caught and convicted, but I would never see the money she had stolen. That reality was bitter but also clarifying. This had never been about financial recovery. This was about justice and accountability, and refusing to allow someone to destroy me without consequences. My parents called again during the third week, this time with a different approach. They had apparently spoken with an attorney who explained the seriousness of the charges Vanessa faced. They now acknowledged that she had likely committed the fraud, though they still could not bring themselves to say she had definitely done it. They wanted to know if I would consider not cooperating with the prosecution if Vanessa came forward and worked out some kind of restitution arrangement. They suggested that maybe Vanessa could pay me back over time, that sending her to prison would not benefit anyone, that family should find ways to resolve conflicts without involving the criminal justice system. The request was so divorced from reality that I initially thought they were joking. When I realized they were serious, I felt something close to pity for them. They were so committed to protecting Vanessa that they could not see how their enabling had created the monster who had committed this crime. I told my parents clearly, and without anger, that I would be cooperating fully with law enforcement and prosecution. Vanessa had not just stolen from me but had committed identity fraud. A crime that affected my credit, my financial security, and my sense of safety. She had researched and planned this crime for months if not years. She had executed it with sophistication, and then fled to avoid accountability. She was not some confused kid who had made an impulsive mistake. She was an adult criminal who had committed a serious felony with premeditation and calculation. If they could not understand why I needed to pursue justice, then we had nothing further to discuss. Mom started crying and saying I was choosing revenge over family. I corrected her gently but firmly. I was not choosing revenge. I was choosing myself for the first time in my life, and if that looked like betrayal to them, it said everything about what they believed my role in the family should be. Dad tried one more manipulation tactic, suggesting that pursuing charges against Vanessa would harm them as well by creating public embarrassment and potentially affecting his retirement if they had to help her with legal fees. I felt nothing but cold clarity as I listened to him try to make Vanessa's crime somehow about his comfort and convenience. I told him that Vanessa's choices had consequences, and those consequences were her responsibility to bear. If they chose to bankrupt themselves helping her, that was their decision. I would not be contributing financially or emotionally to her defense. I would not be visiting her in prison if she was convicted. I would not be maintaining the fiction of family unity to spare them embarrassment. I was done protecting everyone else at my own expense. The call ended with Dad angry and Mom still crying, but I felt no guilt. I had finally learned to let other people's emotions be their own to manage rather than problems for me to solve. The following weeks brought additional discoveries that filled in the picture of Vanessa's deception. The forensic investigation revealed that she had been planning this fraud for at least 18 months before executing it. She had obtained a fake driver's license and social security card using my information, documents sophisticated enough to pass routine verification. She had studied real estate law and closing procedures, likely through online research and possibly consultation with someone who had expertise in the field. She had visited the beach house at least 3 times in the 6 months before the fraud, posing as a prospective buyer touring properties in the area, gathering information and photographs she would later use to answer questions at the closing. The level of premeditation was stunning and also horrifying. This was not a crime of opportunity or desperation. This was a calculated plan executed patiently over many months by someone who had decided I was an acceptable target for serious felony fraud. The buyers of the property, a couple named Michael and Jennifer Lawson with 2 young children, reached out to me through their attorney. They wanted to express how sorry they were about what had happened, and to assure me they had no idea they were purchasing stolen property. They had fallen in love with the house and the private beach, dreaming of summers there with their children, just as I had spent summers there as a child. They had acted in complete good faith, and now they were dealing with the nightmare of discovering their dream home was purchased through fraud. I felt genuine sympathy for them despite my own pain. They were innocent victims of Vanessa's crime just as I was. We arranged to meet at the house one Saturday, an awkward encounter made slightly easier by our shared victimhood. Standing on the porch of the beach house with the Lawsons, looking at the ocean that had always brought me peace, I felt the full weight of what Vanessa had tried to take from me. This was not just property or financial value. This was 4 generations of family history. This was every memory of Grandma Eleanor, every lesson she had taught me about strength and independence. This was the place where I felt most myself, most connected to something larger than everyday concerns. Vanessa had tried to erase all of that for money she would waste just as she had wasted every other resource that came into her hands. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, but so was the resilience I discovered in myself as I stood there. She had tried to take everything and she had failed. I would get my house back. I would recover from this betrayal. I would build a life where people like Vanessa had no power to harm me. Jennifer Lawson asked me about the house's history, and I found myself telling stories about Grandma Eleanor and the summers of my childhood. Their children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, played on the beach collecting shells and sea glass just as I had done at their age. The scene was bittersweet, showing me what might have been if Vanessa's fraud had succeeded. These children would have grown up with memories of this place just as I had. They would have loved it just as I did. But it was mine, left to me specifically by a woman who understood what it meant and who had trusted me to preserve it. That trust was sacred, and defending it against Vanessa's theft was not selfishness but rather honoring a legacy I had been entrusted to protect. By the end of the first month, the legal mechanisms were in motion to unwind the fraudulent sale. The title insurance company was working with all parties to clear the title and restore my ownership officially. The buyers were being made whole through their insurance and bore no ill will toward me. The criminal investigation continued with warrants issued for Vanessa's arrest. I had spent nearly $40,000 on legal fees and various costs. Money I had saved for renovations and retirement, now diverted to cleaning up the wreckage of Vanessa's crime. I was exhausted from the emotional and logistical demands of the situation, but I was also beginning to feel something unexpected. Strength, clarity, a sense of self-worth that was not contingent on being useful to others or maintaining false peace with people who harmed me. The gradual escalation that had led to this point was now visible in sharp relief. Vanessa had spent 3 decades learning that she could take from me without consequence. Every time I had given her money she did not repay, I had taught her I was a reliable source of resources. Every time I had swallowed resentment to keep peace, I had taught her my feelings did not matter. Every time our parents had prioritized her needs over mine, they had reinforced her belief that she was entitled to whatever I had. The pattern had escalated so gradually that I had not recognized it was escalating at all. Small violations had normalized larger ones until finally she believed she could steal my identity and my inheritance without facing meaningful consequences. She had been wrong about that, but only because the fraud happened to be discovered through a routine audit. If not for that chance detection, she would have gotten away with it completely, and I would have learned about the loss only when I went to visit the house and found strangers living there. That realization was perhaps the most disturbing of all. The fraud had succeeded initially, Vanessa had walked out of that closing with nearly $700,000 of what she believed was untraceable money. She had disappeared successfully, and law enforcement was struggling to locate her. In every practical sense, she had won. The only reason I would eventually recover the property was because systems designed to protect property rights had functioned correctly after the fact. But those systems had failed to prevent the crime in the first place. The lesson was clear and harsh. Legal ownership and official documents protected you only as much as the verification systems worked. When those systems failed or when someone was willing to commit serious crimes to circumvent them, you were vulnerable regardless of what papers you possessed or what rights you theoretically held. I thought often during those weeks about all the times I could have prevented this by setting boundaries earlier and more firmly. If I had stopped giving Vanessa money years ago, she might have learned to be financially responsible. If I had refused to enable her lifestyle, she might have developed better character. If I had acknowledged her true nature instead of making excuses for her, I might have recognized the threat she posed. But these thoughts were ultimately unproductive because they assumed Vanessa was capable of learning and changing in ways she had never demonstrated. Some people are takers by nature, predators who see other people only as resources to be exploited. No amount of boundary setting or tough love transforms that fundamental character flaw. The only protection is recognizing it early and removing yourself from their reach before they can cause catastrophic harm. I was learning this lesson at 29, later than I wished but earlier than some people managed. I would spend the rest of my life applying it to every relationship, maintaining boundaries that protected me from exploitation, walking away from people who demonstrated through their actions that they saw me as a resource rather than a person. Vanessa had taught me the most valuable and most painful lesson possible. Some people, even people who share your blood and your history, are fundamentally unsafe. Your only obligation to unsafe people is to protect yourself from them. Everything else, all the family loyalty and forgiveness and second chances, is just enabling that allows them to continue harming you until they finally destroy something you cannot recover from. The coffee shop where I met Jennifer Chun existed in a category of establishment I had previously dismissed as pretentious, the kind of place that served $12 lattes with elaborate foam art and required you to specify the origin region of your beans. Jennifer had suggested it for our meeting, and I arrived early out of habit, ordering a simple black coffee and claiming a table in the back corner where we could speak with some privacy. Jennifer was a colleague from my firm who worked in the tax division, someone I knew professionally, but had never socialized with beyond the occasional group lunch or happy hour. She had sent me an email 3 days earlier asking if we could meet outside the office to discuss something personal, and I had agreed more out of politeness than genuine interest. I had no idea that this conversation would become a pivotal moment in how I understood my situation with Vanessa and my family. Jennifer arrived exactly on time, which I appreciated as someone who valued punctuality. She was a woman in her late 30s, originally from Taiwan, who had immigrated to the United States for graduate school and stayed to build a career in accounting. She had a reputation at the firm for being exceptionally intelligent and unusually direct, qualities that made her an excellent tax strategist, but sometimes created friction in client relationships where people expected more diplomatic communication. She ordered something elaborate involving oat milk and extra espresso shots, then settled into the chair across from me with an expression I could not quite read. It was not quite sympathy but not quite professional neutrality either. Something more complex that suggested she had thought carefully about this meeting before requesting it. She began by acknowledging that what she was about to discuss was extremely personal, and that she hoped I would not be offended by her directness. She explained that Patricia had mentioned in passing during a leadership meeting that I was dealing with a difficult family situation involving fraud, not sharing details but simply explaining why I might need some flexibility with my schedule in the coming months. Jennifer had immediately thought of me because she had been observing something troubling for the past several months and had been uncertain whether or how to address it. Now seemed like the appropriate time to share what she had noticed, even though doing so risked overstepping boundaries or causing offense. I assured her I appreciated directness and asked her to continue, curious about what could have prompted this unusual outreach from someone I barely knew outside of work contexts. Jennifer pulled out her phone and opened a social media application, navigating to a profile I recognized immediately as belonging to Vanessa. I felt my stomach tighten with apprehension even before Jennifer began speaking. She explained that she followed Vanessa's account because they had several mutual connections through the Boston professional network, people Jennifer knew from graduate school who had apparently become part of Vanessa's social circle. Jennifer had noticed my last name in Vanessa's profile and had made the connection that we might be related. A suspicion confirmed when Vanessa posted photographs from a family gathering that included me in the background. Jennifer had not thought much about it initially, merely noting the coincidence of having a work colleague whose sister traveled in overlapping social circles. What had caught Jennifer's attention over the following months was the stark discrepancy between Vanessa's online presentation and comments she made in person at social events. Online, Vanessa projected an image of effortless success and financial abundance. Designer clothes and accessories featured prominently in her photographs. She posted from expensive restaurants and exclusive events. Her captions referenced career achievements and exciting opportunities that suggested she was thriving professionally. The overall impression was of someone who had built an enviable life through talent and hard work. Jennifer had initially accepted this presentation at face value because people generally told the truth about their basic life circumstances, or so she had assumed. However, at an industry networking event several months earlier, Jennifer had overheard Vanessa speaking with another woman about financial difficulties. Vanessa had been complaining about a sister who had inherited valuable property from their grandmother and refused to share it fairly. She described me as selfish and cold, someone who had always been jealous of her and took pleasure in watching her struggle. She claimed I had manipulated our grandmother into leaving me the beach house specifically to hurt her. She described herself as barely surviving financially, while I hoarded generational wealth out of spite. The narrative was so distorted from any reasonable interpretation of events that Jennifer had been startled by the casual dishonesty, but she had not felt it was her place to intervene or correct Vanessa's misrepresentations to strangers. What had transformed Jennifer's passive observation into active concern was an incident at another event about 6 weeks before this coffee shop meeting. Vanessa had approached Jennifer directly, having somehow discovered the connection between us through workplace social media or mutual acquaintances. Vanessa had been charming and friendly, asking about Jennifer's work at the firm and whether she knew me personally. Jennifer had confirmed we were colleagues but had kept the conversation brief and professional, uncomfortable with the direction the interaction seemed to be heading. Vanessa had then asked whether Jennifer knew anything about my financial situation, specifically whether I had significant assets or access to credit that could be leveraged. She had framed the questions as concern for a sister who might be struggling financially, but Jennifer's professional experience with financial fraud had immediately recognized the inquiries as reconnaissance. Jennifer had deflected the questions and ended the conversation, but the interaction had left her deeply uneasy. She recognized the pattern of someone gathering information that could be used for identity theft or financial fraud. She had considered reaching out to me at that time but had hesitated because making such an accusation about someone's family member based on a brief uncomfortable conversation seemed like overreach. She had told herself she was being paranoid, that Vanessa's questions were probably innocent even if awkwardly phrased. She had decided not to interfere in what appeared to be complicated family dynamics that were none of her business. Now, learning that I was dealing with fraud perpetrated by a family member, Jennifer was almost certain that Vanessa had been planning the crime during that conversation and had been attempting to gather additional information that might facilitate it. I sat very still as Jennifer recounted these observations, feeling several distinct emotions cascade through me in rapid succession. First came validation that someone outside my family had recognized Vanessa's dishonesty and predatory behavior without any prompting from me. Then came anger that I had been the subject of Vanessa's lies and manipulations in social contexts I knew nothing about. Following that was a deeper anger at myself for not recognizing the warning signs that had apparently been visible to a relative stranger who had observed Vanessa for only a few months. Finally came a strange gratitude that Jennifer had overcome her discomfort to share this information now, even though it came too late to prevent the fraud. The timing of her outreach suggested she felt some responsibility for not warning me earlier, though I could not blame her for respecting boundaries and assuming I was aware of my own sister's character. Jennifer apologized for not reaching out sooner, explaining that she had struggled with the ethics of interfering in someone's family relationships based on limited information and her own possibly biased interpretation of events. She understood from professional experience that family dynamics were complex, and that outsiders rarely had complete information. She had not wanted to create conflict or damage relationships based on what might have been misunderstandings or her own prejudices. However, learning that fraud had actually occurred exactly as her instincts had warned made her feel she had failed in some responsibility to provide warning. She wanted me to know what she had observed in case it was helpful for the legal proceedings, or simply for my own understanding of how long Vanessa had been planning this crime. I thanked Jennifer for her willingness to share difficult information and assured her that she bore no responsibility for not warning me earlier. I explained that I would not have believed such warnings even if she had provided them because I had been deeply invested in maintaining an inaccurate understanding of who my sister was. I had spent nearly 3 decades explaining away evidence of Vanessa's true character, because accepting that reality would have required acknowledging that my family was fundamentally dysfunctional, and that I had been complicit in enabling destructive patterns. External warnings would have been dismissed as misunderstandings or prejudice from people who did not know Vanessa the way I did. The wake-up call could only have come from something so undeniable that rationalization was impossible, which was exactly what the fraud had provided. Jennifer then shared something unexpected that reframed much of what I thought I understood about the situation. She explained that in her observation, Vanessa was not simply an irresponsible person who made poor choices. She recognized in Vanessa's behavior patterns consistent with a personality disorder characterized by exploitation of others, lack of genuine empathy, and belief in special entitlement to resources and treatment that others did not deserve. Jennifer was not a mental health professional and acknowledged she could not and should not diagnose anyone. However, her mother had struggled with similar patterns, and Jennifer had spent years in therapy understanding those dynamics and how they had affected her own development. She recognized the sophisticated manipulation, the careful construction of false narratives, and the complete absence of genuine remorse or accountability that characterized certain personality presentations. This framing was simultaneously enlightening and disturbing. I had always conceptualized Vanessa's behavior as selfishness and immaturity, problems that could theoretically be addressed through consequences and personal growth. The possibility that her patterns reflected something more fundamental and less changeable shifted how I understood our entire history. If Vanessa truly lacked the capacity for genuine empathy or saw other people primarily as resources to be exploited, then nothing I could have done differently would have changed the outcome. Setting boundaries earlier might have protected me sooner, but it would not have transformed her into someone capable of reciprocal relationships. She was simply not constructed that way, and recognizing that was both liberating and profoundly sad. Jennifer suggested I might benefit from reading about narcissistic personality patterns in family systems that enable them, not to excuse Vanessa's behavior, but to understand the dynamics that had made me vulnerable to exploitation. She recommended several books and online resources that had helped her process her own family experiences. She emphasized that understanding these patterns was not about blame, but about recognizing warning signs early enough to protect yourself before catastrophic harm occurred. She shared that she had gone no contact with her mother 5 years earlier after recognizing that every interaction left her depleted and diminished. The decision had been difficult and had created conflict with extended family, who believed she should be more forgiving and accommodating. However, it had also been the healthiest choice she had ever made for herself, allowing her to build a life free from constant manipulation and emotional abuse. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours as I asked questions and Jennifer shared both her personal experiences and what she had learned through therapy and research. She explained the concept of supply in narcissistic relationships, where people like Vanessa required constant validation and resources from others to maintain their self-image. I had been a reliable source of both emotional and financial supply for Vanessa, someone who could be counted on to provide resources while accepting poor treatment in return. As long as I served that function, Vanessa had maintained some connection with me. When I finally set a boundary by refusing to give her more money, I stopped being useful in that capacity. Her decision to commit fraud rather than accept the boundary made perfect sense within that framework. She needed resources I was no longer voluntarily providing them, so she took them by force through deception. Jennifer also explained something called hoovering, a term for the pattern where people like Vanessa would attempt to draw you back into relationship after a period of distance by using manipulation tactics ranging from love bombing to crises to threats. She warned that even with Vanessa facing criminal charges and presumably in hiding, I should expect attempts at contact designed to manipulate me into providing help or withdrawing cooperation with prosecution. These attempts would likely be sophisticated, targeting my remaining guilt or family loyalty, possibly involving other family members as intermediaries. Jennifer advised that the only effective response was complete no contact, refusing to engage with any communication regardless of how compelling or emergency-oriented it seemed. Any response, even a response telling Vanessa to leave me alone, provided information that manipulation had successfully provoked reaction and should be continued or modified. This practical advice felt more valuable than anything I had received from the various professionals I had been working with over the past month. Lawyers and law enforcement understood the legal dimensions of the fraud. Therapists I had started seeing understood the emotional trauma of betrayal. But Jennifer understood the specific psychology of people like Vanessa, and the particular vulnerabilities of people like me, who had been shaped by years of relationship with them. She recognized that my greatest danger was not financial or legal, but rather my own deeply ingrained patterns of accommodation and rescue. Vanessa's most effective weapon had never been her ability to forge documents or steal money. It had been her understanding of exactly which emotional buttons to push to make me doubt my own perceptions and prioritize her needs over my own well-being. We exchanged contact information as we prepared to leave the coffee shop, with Jennifer encouraging me to reach out if I needed to process anything or if Vanessa made contact attempts. She offered to be a reality check when I felt myself wavering or questioning whether I was being too harsh or unforgiving. She understood from her own experience that people recovering from these kinds of relationships often struggled with guilt and doubt, particularly when other family members pressured them to reconcile or forgive prematurely. Having someone outside the family system who could reflect back reality without the distortions created by years of dysfunctional patterns was invaluable during the recovery process. I accepted her offer gratefully, recognizing that I needed exactly this kind of support from someone who understood these dynamics from personal experience rather than just theoretical knowledge. Walking to my car after the meeting, I felt a strange combination of emotions that I struggled to name precisely. There was grief for the years I had lost to a relationship that had been fundamentally exploitative from the beginning. There was anger at myself for not recognizing what someone like Jennifer had identified within months of casual observation. There was relief at finally having a framework that explained behaviors that had previously seemed random or inexplicable. There was fear about what Jennifer's predictions about future manipulation attempts meant for how long I would need to maintain vigilance. Underlying all of it was a growing sense of clarity that was uncomfortable but also stabilizing. I could not change the past, but I could use this understanding to make radically different choices about the future. That evening, I began researching the resources Jennifer had recommended. I read articles about narcissistic family dynamics and found descriptions that could have been written specifically about my family. The golden child who could do no wrong paired with the scapegoat who was blamed for family problems. The enabling parents who sacrificed the scapegoat's well-being to maintain peace with the golden child. The pattern of increasing exploitation over time, as boundaries eroded, and the scapegoat was conditioned to accept worse treatment. The eventual crisis when the scapegoat finally refused to continue the pattern, leading to escalation rather than acceptance of the new boundary. Every element matched my experience with such precision that I felt simultaneously vindicated and devastated. I found online forums where people shared experiences eerily similar to my own. Adult children who had been financially exploited by siblings while parents enabled or encouraged it. People who had been victims of identity theft or fraud perpetrated by family members who felt entitled to their resources. Individuals who had gone no contact with families who could not or would not acknowledge abuse and exploitation. Reading these accounts was both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because I was clearly not alone in experiencing these patterns, suggesting I was not defective or responsible for creating the dysfunction. Disturbing because the outcomes were so consistently negative. Very few of these stories ended with family reconciliation or the exploitative person developing insight and changing. Most ended with permanent estrangement and ongoing grief over relationships that could never be what the victim had hoped they could be. One post in particular struck me with its relevance to my situation. A woman described her sister stealing and selling jewelry their mother had left to her, then using the money to fund a lifestyle of luxury travel and designer purchases. When confronted, The sister had denied everything despite overwhelming evidence. When the evidence became undeniable, she had claimed the inheritance was unfair, and she deserved compensation. When legal action was pursued, she had disappeared and remained in hiding for 3 years before eventually being arrested in another state on unrelated charges. The victim of the theft described the years of waiting for justice as a kind of torment, never knowing when or if her sister would be held accountable. She warned others in similar situations not to put their lives on hold waiting for closure that might never come. The only way forward was to accept the loss and build a life that was not defined by the betrayal. That advice resonated deeply as I thought about my own situation. Vanessa had vanished successfully and might remain hidden indefinitely. The criminal justice system was pursuing her, but that process could take months or years to reach any conclusion. I could either spend that time consumed by anger and focused on retribution, or I could use it to heal and rebuild. The fraud had cost me money and a sense of security, but it did not have to cost me the rest of my life. I could choose to view it as the painful but necessary end of a toxic relationship, rather than an ongoing crisis that paralyzed me. That choice felt revolutionary after a lifetime of allowing Vanessa's chaos to dominate my emotional landscape. I scheduled a session with the therapist I had started seeing after the fraud was discovered. Her name was Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a clinical psychologist who specialized in family trauma and recovery from abusive relationships. I shared with her what Jennifer had told me about personality disorders and narcissistic family dynamics, asking whether that framework was relevant to my situation, or whether Jennifer's own trauma was causing her to see patterns that did not exist. Dr. Walsh listened carefully, asked clarifying questions about specific incidents from my history with Vanessa, and then confirmed that Jennifer's observations appeared accurate based on the behavioral patterns I described. She explained that formal diagnosis required extensive evaluation and was ultimately less important than understanding the relational dynamics and how they had affected me. Dr. Walsh helped me understand that I had been unconsciously playing a role in my family system for my entire life, a role that required me to be endlessly giving while accepting poor treatment in return. This role had not been forced on me through explicit coercion but rather through subtle reinforcement over many years. I received approval when I sacrificed my needs for Vanessa's wants. I received criticism or withdrawal of affection when I asserted boundaries or prioritized my own well-being. Over time, I learned that love and belonging within my family were conditional on maintaining this role. The cost of stepping out of it was rejection and conflict, which felt intolerable to a child and remained difficult for an adult who still craved family connection. The revolutionary act, Dr. Walsh explained, was recognizing that I could choose to leave the role even knowing it would mean losing relationships with people who only valued me for playing it. This was not selfishness or cruelty. This was basic self-preservation and the foundation of genuine self-worth. As long as I continued playing the designated role, I remained trapped in patterns that would eventually destroy me. Vanessa's fraud was extreme, but it was also the logical endpoint of dynamics that had been building for decades. If I returned to the family system without fundamentally changing my participation in it, similar violations would occur in different forms because the underlying structure rewarded exploitation and punished healthy boundaries. Dr. Walsh introduced the concept of radical acceptance, which did not mean condoning what had happened, but rather fully accepting reality without wishful thinking or denial. My sister was someone who had demonstrated through consistent behavior over decades that she was not safe or trustworthy. My parents were people who would prioritize maintaining their preferred family narrative over acknowledging harm done to me. These were facts, not temporary situations that might change with enough patience or the right approach. Accepting these facts allowed me to make clear decisions about what level of contact and relationship was actually safe and sustainable. Fighting against reality by trying to change unchangeable people or situations only prolonged suffering and prevented healing. This framework gave me permission to stop hoping that Vanessa would eventually develop insight or remorse. It freed me from the obligation to maintain relationships with my parents if they continued to prioritize protecting her over supporting me. It clarified that walking away from toxic family relationships was not abandonment, but rather appropriate boundary setting with people who had demonstrated they would harm me given the opportunity. The cultural narrative about family being forever and forgiveness being mandatory had kept me trapped in patterns that were literally dangerous. Rejecting that narrative in favor of one that prioritized my actual safety and well-being was not rebellious or selfish. It was simply sane. Over the following weeks, I noticed myself processing the fraud differently than I had in the immediate aftermath. The raw shock and pain began transforming into something more solid and less reactive. I could think about what Vanessa had done without feeling overwhelmed by emotion. I could discuss the situation with lawyers and law enforcement without crying or losing composure. I could work effectively at my job again because I was no longer constantly consumed by crisis response. The situation had not resolved itself. Vanessa was still missing, the legal processes were still ongoing, and my relationship with my parents remained fractured. But I was adapting to a new reality where I no longer expected or hoped for outcomes that were fundamentally unlikely. Jennifer checked in with me periodically, usually brief text messages asking how I was managing, or whether there had been any developments. Her support felt qualitatively different from the sympathy offered by people who had not lived through similar experiences. She did not offer false reassurance that everything would work out or that time would heal all wounds. She acknowledged that some betrayals left permanent scars, and that healing meant learning to live with those scars, rather than making them disappear. She validated my anger and my grief while also encouraging me to focus on building a life that was not defined by what Vanessa had stolen. Her friendship, unexpected and arising from such painful circumstances, became one of the few genuinely positive developments in an otherwise devastating period. The wake-up call Jennifer had provided came too late to prevent the fraud, but exactly the right time to prevent me from making additional mistakes in how I responded to it. Without her perspective, I might have continued believing that Vanessa's behavior reflected temporary problems rather than fundamental character issues. I might have remained vulnerable to future manipulation attempts or pressure from family to reconcile prematurely. I might have blamed myself for not being more understanding or forgiving, rather than recognizing that the appropriate response to serious betrayal is protective distance. Jennifer's willingness to share her observations and experiences gave me tools I desperately needed to navigate the difficult months ahead. As I reflected on the conversation in the coffee shop and everything that had followed from it, I recognized that sometimes the most important help comes from unexpected sources. The professionals I was working with provided valuable assistance within their domains of expertise. But Jennifer provided something different and equally essential: validation from someone who had no agenda beyond wanting to help another person avoid the mistakes she had made in her own journey. She had been where I was, had learned hard lessons about family dysfunction and personality disorders, and was generous enough to share that hard-won wisdom when she recognized someone else struggling with similar dynamics. That generosity of spirit felt like a gift I would spend the rest of my life trying to pay forward to others in similar circumstances. The transformation of my understanding occurred not in a single dramatic revelation, but through the steady accumulation of evidence that painted an increasingly damning portrait of Vanessa's calculated deception. Each new piece of information that emerged during the investigation added another layer to a picture I had been unconsciously refusing to see for most of my adult life. The process was similar to developing a photograph in a darkroom, where the image gradually becomes visible as chemicals interact with exposed film. What emerged from this development process was not the sister I thought I knew, but rather a stranger who had been methodically planning my victimization while I remained obliviously trusting. The forensic accountants hired by the title insurance company to trace the money from the fraudulent sale produced a report that arrived during my 4th week of dealing with the crisis. The document was over 60 pages of dense financial analysis, transaction records, and investigative findings that read like a thriller novel, except the protagonist was my sister, and the victim was me. I sat at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning, reading through the entire report without pause, feeling my understanding of the situation shift fundamentally with each section. What I had initially conceptualized as an impulsive crime of opportunity revealed itself to be a sophisticated fraud executed with planning and precision that demonstrated both intelligence and complete moral bankruptcy. The financial trail began 18 months before the fraudulent closing, far earlier than I had initially realized. Vanessa had opened a bank account at a small regional bank in New Hampshire, using falsified documents that established her identity as Claire Hartwell. The account was opened with a modest initial deposit of $500 and was used sparingly for the first several months, establishing a pattern of normal activity that would not raise suspicions when large sums eventually moved through it. This demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how financial institutions monitored for suspicious activity. A brand new account receiving a sudden large deposit would trigger immediate scrutiny. An account with established history showing normal patterns of activity would be less likely to raise red flags when the fraudulent funds arrived. During those 18 months, Vanessa had made small deposits and withdrawals that created the appearance of ordinary banking activity. She had set up autopay for a cell phone bill and a small monthly subscription service. She had deposited checks that appeared to be from freelance work or gig economy jobs, amounts ranging from $200 to $800 arriving irregularly, but frequently enough to establish legitimate income patterns. The forensic accountants noted that these deposits were likely manufactured, possibly checks she wrote to herself from accounts controlled by accomplices or money laundering techniques, designed to create the appearance of legitimate employment income. The sophistication of this setup period revealed that Vanessa had researched financial fraud extensively and understood exactly what kind of account history would allow her to eventually move large sums without triggering automatic fraud detection systems. The report documented multiple visits Vanessa had made to Seacliff during the 18 months before the fraud, far more than I had been aware of. She had stayed at a bed and breakfast in town on at least 6 occasions, each visit lasting 2 to 4 days. Security camera footage from a real estate office where she had posed as a potential buyer showed her touring properties throughout the area, gathering information about local market conditions and typical closing procedures. She had met with at least 2 different real estate agents, claiming to be relocating from Boston for work and looking for oceanfront property similar to the house she was currently renting, a description that matched my beach house closely enough that she could later demonstrate detailed knowledge of the property to the closing attorney. During one of these reconnaissance visits, Vanessa had apparently entered the beach house itself when I was not there. The forensic team discovered photographs on her cloud storage account showing interior rooms from angles and perspectives that could only have been taken by someone standing inside the house. The photographs were dated to a weekend when I had been visiting friends in Vermont, unable to make my usual trip to Seacliff. I remembered that weekend clearly because I had felt guilty about missing it, the first time in over a year that I had not made the weekly pilgrimage. Vanessa must have been monitoring my social media closely enough to know when I would be away, then used that opportunity to break into the house and document it thoroughly for the fraud she was already planning. The violation of discovering she had been inside the house without my knowledge or permission felt almost as disturbing as the fraud itself. I imagined her walking through rooms that held my most precious memories, touching things that belonged to Grandma Eleanor, photographing details she would later use to convince a closing attorney that she was the legitimate owner. The beach house had been my sanctuary, the one place where I felt completely safe and at peace. Learning that Vanessa had invaded that space in preparation for stealing it from me permanently destroyed that sense of sanctuary in ways that would take years to rebuild. Every corner of the house now carried the shadow of her trespass, contaminating memories with the knowledge of her predatory assessment. The report detailed the creation of sophisticated fake identification documents that Vanessa had commissioned from sources the investigators had not yet been able to trace. The fake driver's license she had used at the closing was of professional quality, incorporating security features and holograms that made it nearly indistinguishable from legitimate documents issued by the state. The investigators believed she had paid between $3,000 and $5,000 for the fake identification, suggesting she had invested significant upfront capital in executing the fraud. This contradicted her claims to family and friends that she was constantly struggling financially. She had found money for elaborate fraud preparations while continuing to claim poverty when asking me or our parents for help with basic living expenses. The social media investigation produced particularly damning evidence of Vanessa's double life. Her public-facing accounts projected an image of successful professional achievement and financial comfort, carefully curated photographs showing designer clothes, upscale restaurants, and luxury experiences. However, investigators had obtained access to private messages and emails through legal processes associated with the fraud case, and these private communications told a radically different story. She complained constantly to various friends about being broke, about hating her jobs, about feeling entitled to wealth that had been unfairly denied to her. She expressed explicit resentment toward me in messages to close confidants, referring to me with crude insults and claiming I had stolen her inheritance through manipulation of our grandmother. One series of messages was particularly illuminating and particularly painful to read. Vanessa had been texting with someone identified only as Marcus, presumably the boyfriend she had been living with, about their plan to solve their financial problems permanently. She wrote about the beach house as if it were a treasure chest waiting to be plundered, estimating its value and discussing how they would split the proceeds. She described me as too stupid and trusting to ever suspect what they were planning. She joked about how easy it would be to impersonate me because I was so boring and predictable that even strangers would believe she was Claire Hartwell. The contempt and calculation in those messages was breathtaking, revealing that she viewed the fraud not as a desperate last resort, but as a clever scheme to take what she believed she deserved from someone she held in complete contempt. Marcus emerged as a significant figure in the investigation, though his identity remained somewhat mysterious. He appeared to have expertise in financial systems and possibly a background in banking or real estate, based on the sophistication of advice he provided in their message exchanges. He coached Vanessa on what documents would be needed, how to respond to questions at the closing, and how to move the money after the sale completed in ways that would be difficult to trace. The investigators believed he might have a criminal history involving financial fraud, though they had not yet confirmed his full identity or located him for questioning. He had apparently disappeared at the same time as Vanessa, suggesting they remained together, and were potentially continuing to commit frauds against other victims. The report documented the actual closing day in detail that made it feel simultaneously more real and more surreal. Vanessa had arrived at the attorney's office dressed professionally in clothes I recognized from her social media posts, expensive items she must have purchased specifically for this performance. She had been accompanied by Marcus, who had introduced himself as her husband though they were never legally married based on public record searches. They had presented all required documentation with confidence and answered questions smoothly, demonstrating the extensive preparation they had completed. The closing attorney who handled the transaction was interviewed by investigators and expressed shock upon learning the sale was fraudulent, insisting there had been nothing about the interaction that raised suspicions or suggested deception. Video footage from the bank where Vanessa had deposited the cashier's check from the sale showed her barely able to contain her excitement. She smiled broadly as she conducted the transaction, chatting casually with the teller about having finally sold a property she had owned for years. She mentioned plans to travel and invest the money wisely, performing the role of a responsible adult managing a significant financial windfall. The teller remembered her as pleasant and unremarkable, exactly the kind of ordinary transaction that occurred hundreds of times daily at the bank. Nothing about Vanessa's demeanor suggested she was committing a serious felony that could result in years of prison time. She appeared relaxed and happy, someone who had accomplished something significant and was enjoying the rewards. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.